As the night deepens, attention often turns inward, not toward thought exactly, but toward the sense of self that has been carried all day. Roles, impressions, preferences, reactions, the quiet structure of who I am remains present, as if it needs to be kept intact even in rest. The Stoics noticed this tendency with care. They understood that the self is not a fixed object that requires upkeep. It is a movement, one that becomes heavier when it is constantly adjusted. During the day, maintenance feels necessary. The self is refined through action, corrected through response, protected through awareness. But night removes the conditions that require this work. There is no interaction here that needs managing, no image to uphold, no version of yourself that must remain consistent. The Stoics saw that much of mental fatigue comes not from experience itself, but from the effort to maintain continuity of identity. The mind keeps track of itself. It reviews how it appeared, how it reacted, how it should have been. This internal maintenance continues even when the body has stopped moving. But the self does not weaken when it is unattended. It does not collapse when attention withdraws. It does not require supervision to remain whole. At night, the self can rest without consequence. Nothing essential is lost when identity softens. Nothing important disappears when roles loosen their grip. The Stoics understood that identity is useful for action, but unnecessary for rest. When the mind allows this, a subtle relief appears. The effort to remain someone specific dissolves. The need to be coherent fades. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer organize themselves around self-reference. They do not ask what this means about you. Awareness becomes broader, less personal. The body responds naturally. Breathing slows when it is no longer tied to identity. Muscles release when they are no longer holding posture for presentation. The self does not need to be maintained through the night. It will return when action is required again. The Stoics believe that wisdom includes knowing when to step out of the way of one's own identity. Night offers this opportunity. Nothing needs to be held together here. Nothing needs to remain defined. The self can loosen, not into confusion, but into simplicity. And within this simplicity, rest deepens, not because the self has been improved, but because it has been allowed to be unnecessary for a while. As the effort to maintain the self softens, another possibility quietly appears. The self can be set down, not removed, not rejected, simply placed aside, the way an object is set down when it is no longer needed for the moment. The Stoics understood identity as something functional rather than permanent, a role assumed for action, a structure used to navigate the world. But like any tool, it does not need to be held at all times. During the day, identity provides orientation. It answers questions. It organizes response. It gives continuity to action. At night, these functions are suspended. There is no situation here that requires a defined position. No interaction that depends on who you are. No moment that needs to be interpreted through a personal lens. And yet, the mind often keeps identity close, as if setting it down would invite instability. The Stoics saw this fear clearly. They knew that identity feels protective because it is familiar. But familiarity is not the same as necessity. Nothing essential depends on remaining defined through the night. Identity does not vanish when it is not attended to. It simply rests. When the mind allows this, a quiet spaciousness opens. Thoughts lose their attachment to narrative. They no longer ask how they reflect on you. They do not gather themselves into a story. Awareness becomes less centered, less concerned with position. The body responds to this shift naturally. Posture loosens when there is no role to inhabit. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by self-awareness. The Stoics believed that peace emerges when the self is allowed to step out of the foreground. Not erased, not dissolved, just no longer required. Setting down identity does not create emptiness. It creates room. Room where experience is not filtered through ownership. Room where sensations do not need interpretation. The night supports this release quietly. There is no demand to know who you are here, no expectation that identity remain intact. The self can be picked up again when the day returns. It will be there when it is needed. For now it can rest alongside the body. The Stoics understood that wisdom includes knowing when to stop carrying what no longer serves. Identity serves action. It does not serve rest. And when it is allowed to be set down, the mind softens its grip, attention widens, and rest deepens, not because anything has been lost, but because something unnecessary has finally been allowed to remain unused. When identity is allowed to be set down, the mind may still hold on to one quiet demand, that the self must remain coherent, a sense that thoughts should align, that feelings should make sense together, that experience should form a consistent shape, even in rest. The Stoics noticed this tendency with precision. They understood that coherence is useful for action, but unnecessary for stillness. During the day, coherence creates stability. It allows decisions to follow one another. It supports responsibility and direction. But night removes the need for continuity. There is no path to maintain here, no argument to keep intact, no version of yourself that must remain internally consistent. And yet the mind often continues its quiet work. It organizes impressions. It tries to reconcile emotions. It looks for agreement between what is felt and what is understood. This effort keeps the self lightly engaged. The Stoics saw that much inner tension comes from forcing coherence where none is required. Thoughts do not need to agree with one another in the night. Feelings do not need explanation. Contradictions do not need resolution. Experience is allowed to be uneven. At night, the self does not need to make sense. When this is permitted, something softens deeply. Thoughts lose their obligation to connect. They appear without needing to belong to a larger pattern. They pass without asking where they fit. Awareness becomes more fluid, less structured, less concerned with order. The body responds naturally to this loosening. Breathing settles when it is no longer shaped by interpretation. Muscles release when they are no longer holding internal alignment. The Stoics believed that peace emerges when the mind stops insisting on internal harmony at all times. Harmony is not achieved by force. It appears when pressure withdraws. Night offers this withdrawal. There is no need to understand yourself here. No need to resolve conflicting impressions. No need to make the inner world orderly before rest is allowed. The self can be fragmented without consequence, incomplete without danger, unclear without threat. Nothing important depends on internal agreement right now. The Stoics understood that wisdom includes knowing when coherence serves life and when it interferes with rest. The night belongs to the latter. When coherence is no longer demanded, the self relaxes its internal grip. Experience becomes lighter, less defined, less personal. And within this loosened state, rest deepens naturally, not because the self has found clarity, but because it has been released from the quiet obligation to make sense of itself. When coherence is released, another assumption quietly loosens. The idea that you must be someone, that even in rest, a recognizable self must remain present. That identity should stay assembled, available, and intact, as if disappearing from oneself, even briefly, would be unsafe. The Stoics questioned this assumption carefully. They understood that identity is not a constant demand of existence. It is a condition that becomes relevant only when action is required. During the day, being someone matters. Roles are assumed. Names are answered to. Decisions are shaped by character and history. But night removes the need for all of this. There is no one to respond to here. No situation that depends on who you are. No expectation that a particular version of yourself remain present. And yet the mind often stays lightly assembled, holding the sense of self in place, as if identity must remain on duty. The Stoics saw this as a habit rather than a necessity, a habit formed through repetition and responsibility. But habits lose their purpose when conditions change. At night, you are not required to represent yourself. You are not required to maintain continuity. You are not required to stand behind any particular story. Nothing depends on your personality right now. Nothing asks for your character or your preferences. When this is recognized, the pressure to remain defined begins to soften. The sense of me loosens its edges, not into confusion, but into neutrality. Thoughts may still appear, but they no longer announce themselves as yours. They drift without attachment. Awareness becomes less centered, less personal, less concerned with position. The body responds immediately. Muscles release when there is no posture to hold. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by self-consciousness. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind is allowed to step out of identity without resistance. Not erased, not denied, simply not required. You do not lose yourself by resting from who you are. You regain simplicity. The self will return when needed. It always does. For now it can remain unused. The night does not demand a name. It does not ask for definition. It does not require consistency. It offers a space where being someone is optional, and in this space, the mind finally relaxes its effort, not because it has stopped existing, but because it no longer needs to perform existence. Rest deepens here in the absence of identity, where nothing needs to be upheld, and nothing needs to remain recognizably you. When the need to be someone softens, another quiet impulse may still remain. The urge to explain, a subtle tendency to account for thoughts, to justify feelings, to understand why the mind moves the way it does, even when nothing is being asked. The Stoics observed this impulse closely. They understood that explanation is a tool of orientation. It helps the mind place events within a framework of cause and meaning. During the day, this is useful. Explanations guide decisions. They support learning, correction, and responsibility. But night does not require orientation. There is no situation here that needs to be understood, no behavior to justify, no inner state that must be clarified before rest can occur. And yet the mind often continues its quiet commentary. It asks why a thought appeared, why a feeling lingered, why something did not resolve as expected. This search for explanation keeps the self active. The Stoics understood that not every inner movement needs interpretation. Some experiences are complete without meaning. Some sensations arise and pass without explanation. At night, explanation adds weight where none is required. When the mind allows this, thoughts no longer need to defend their presence. Feelings do not need context to be allowed. Awareness becomes less analytical, less invested in cause and effect. The body responds naturally to this release. Breathing smooths when it is no longer shaped by inquiry. Muscles soften when there is no need to understand sensation. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops interrogating itself, not because understanding is harmful, but because its timing matters. Explanation belongs to reflection. Night belongs to rest. There is nothing here that must make sense, nothing that requires a reason to be permitted. You do not need to understand yourself in order to sleep. You do not need clarity to let go. The self does not improve through explanation in this moment. It simply becomes tired. When explanation is set aside, the inner world loosens. Thoughts lose their argumentative tone. They no longer ask to be resolved. Experience becomes quieter, less layered, less demanding. The Stoics understood that wisdom includes knowing when to stop asking questions. Night is that moment. The self does not need explanation here. It does not require interpretation to remain intact. And when the need to explain dissolves, the mind releases another layer of effort, allowing rest to deepen in a space where nothing needs to be justified, nothing needs to be understood, and nothing needs to be made reasonable before it is allowed to fade. Even when explanation is released, the mind may still hold on to another quiet expectation, that the self must remain consistent, a subtle insistence that thoughts should align with earlier thoughts, that feelings should follow a recognizable pattern, that the inner world should remain stable and familiar, even in rest. The Stoics noticed how deeply this expectation shapes inner tension. They understood that consistency serves action, but it is unnecessary for stillness. During the day, consistency offers reliability. It allows others to predict us. It allows us to predict ourselves. It supports responsibility and continuity. But night does not depend on predictability. There is no role here that requires steadiness, no audience that needs reassurance, no situation that benefits from sameness. And yet the mind often continues to monitor itself. It notices when feelings change quickly. It becomes uneasy when thoughts contradict one another. It searches for alignment even when nothing is at stake. This effort creates subtle strain. The Stoics understood that inconsistency is not a flaw in rest. It is a natural expression of a mind no longer held in place by action. Nothing important is harmed by this. The self does not fracture when it is inconsistent. It simply loosens. When the mind allows inconsistency, pressure eases. Thoughts no longer need to agree. Feelings no longer need to justify their presence by lasting. Awareness becomes more fluid, less structured around identity. The body responds immediately. Muscles release when they are no longer holding inner posture. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by self-regulation. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops correcting itself unnecessarily. Correction belongs to action. Night belongs to allowance. There is no need to remain the same from moment to moment. No need to maintain emotional continuity. No need to ensure that the self behaves consistently. Inconsistency here is not instability. It is freedom from supervision. The night does not require a stable version of you. It does not demand coherence across time. It allows the self to shift, to soften, to change shape without consequence. And in this allowance, the self relaxes its effort. Consistency fades as a requirement. Identity loosens its grip. Rest deepens, not because the self has found balance, but because it has been released from the quiet obligation to remain the same. Even when consistency is released, the mind may still hold on to a deeply learned impulse, the urge to improve, a quiet sense that something about the self should be refined, corrected, or made better, that rest is acceptable only after progress has been made, or at least planned. The Stoics recognize this impulse as one of the most persistent habits of the inner life. They understood how easily self-improvement becomes a background demand, operating even when no action is possible. During the day, improvement feels meaningful. Skills are developed, judgments are adjusted, character is shaped through choice and effort. But night exists outside this process. There is no action here that can be improved, no behavior that benefits from correction, no advantage gained by becoming better in this moment. And yet the mind often continues its quiet work. It revisits mistakes. It imagines future versions of itself. It rehearses how things might be handled more wisely next time. This effort keeps the self slightly engaged, never fully at rest. The Stoics understood that improvement has its proper time. It belongs to reflection, intention, and action. Night is none of these. At night, the self does not need to grow. It does not need to evolve. It does not need to be fixed. Nothing essential is at risk if improvement pauses. The mind often resists this idea. It fears stagnation. It worries that rest without progress equals decline. But the Stoics saw that rest is not the opposite of growth. It is what allows growth to remain sustainable. Improvement that continues without pause becomes strain. When the mind allows improvement to rest, another layer of pressure dissolves. There is no inner project to manage, no version of the self waiting to be achieved. Thoughts lose their evaluative tone. They no longer ask whether something could have been better. Awareness becomes less future-oriented, less invested in change. The body responds immediately. Muscles soften when they are no longer preparing for effort. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by ambition. The Stoics believed that wisdom includes knowing when not to work on oneself. Night is that moment. The self does not need refinement here. It does not need correction or direction. It is sufficient as it is, not as a conclusion, but as a pause. And in this pause, the self finally releases its quiet striving, allowing rest to deepen in a space where nothing needs to be better, nothing needs to be added, and nothing needs to change in order for sleep to arrive. Even when the urge to improve softens, the mind may still remain quietly alert, protective, a subtle readiness to defend the self, to guard its boundaries, to anticipate threat, to remain prepared for harm that might never arrive. The Stoics observed this posture with clarity. They understood that protection is a response to perceived danger, and that the mind often continues to protect long after danger has passed. During the day, this vigilance has purpose. The self navigates uncertainty. It evaluates risk. It prepares responses. But night changes the terrain. There is nothing here that requires defense, no interaction that could injure identity, no situation that demands readiness. And yet the mind may continue scanning quietly, monitoring thoughts, checking emotional exposure, holding itself slightly tense. This constant guarding creates fatigue. The Stoics saw that much inner exhaustion comes not from what happens, but from what the mind remains prepared for. At night, the self is not under threat. It does not need shielding. It does not need to stay intact through vigilance. Nothing is being asked of it. When this is recognized, the posture of defense begins to soften. The mind no longer needs to brace itself. It does not need to stay organized against intrusion. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer feel dangerous. They pass without needing to be managed. Awareness becomes less guarded, less watchful, less concerned with boundaries. The body responds immediately. Muscles release when there is no longer a need to brace. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by alertness. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind understands that protection is unnecessary in moments of safety. Night is such a moment. There is no self to defend here, no image to protect, no position to secure. The self can soften without consequence. Vulnerability here is not exposure, it is rest. The night does not test you. It does not challenge identity. It does not ask for resilience. It allows the self to exist without armor. And when protection is no longer required, the self relaxes its final tension. Nothing needs to be held together. Nothing needs to be guarded. Rest deepens, not because the self has been secured, but because it has been allowed to be unprotected, unwatched, and entirely safe in the quiet of the night. Even when protection softens, the mind may still hold on to one final position: control. A quiet belief that the self must remain in charge, that thoughts should be guided, that emotions should be regulated, that inner movement should remain directed, even in rest. The Stoics examined this impulse carefully. They understood that control has value only where action is possible, where choice can still shape outcome. During the day, control creates order. It directs attention. It restrains impulse. It allows intention to guide behavior. But night removes the field where control operates. There is no decision to steer here, no response to manage, no consequence that depends on inner regulation. And yet the mind often continues to oversee itself. It notices when thoughts drift too freely. It becomes uneasy when emotions move without permission. It attempts to gently correct, even when nothing is wrong. This supervision creates subtle tension. The Stoics understood that control, when unnecessary, becomes interference. It keeps the self engaged in a role that no longer applies. At night, the self does not need governance. Nothing benefits from restraint. Nothing is endangered by looseness. When this is recognized, the grip of control begins to relax. Thoughts no longer need to be shaped. They can wander without consequence. They do not require redirection. Emotions can rise and fall without regulation. They do not need balance. They do not need resolution. Awareness becomes less directive, less invested in outcome. The body responds immediately. Muscles release when there is no longer a need to hold control. Breathing deepens when it is no longer guided or corrected. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops trying to govern what does not require governance. Control belongs to effort. Night belongs to release. There is no inner system to manage here, no state to stabilize, no process to oversee. The self does not fall apart without control. It softens. In this softening, attention loosens its grip. Experience becomes quieter, less organized, less intentional. And this is not disorder. It is rest. The night does not need a manager. It does not need direction. It allows the self to drift, to loosen, to exist without command. And when control is finally released, the self settles naturally, not into chaos, but into stillness. A stillness that does not need to be held, maintained, or protected. A stillness that arrives when nothing remains, that feels responsible for keeping the self together. Even when control loosens, the mind may still lean toward one remaining habit: direction, a quiet orientation toward somewhere else, a sense that the self should be moving toward clarity, toward resolution, toward a more settled state. The Stoics noticed how persistent this forward lean can be. They understood that direction is useful when action is required, but unnecessary when nothing is meant to be reached. During the day, direction provides momentum. It organizes effort. It gives shape to intention. But night removes the need for movement. There is no destination here, no inner state that must be arrived at before rest is allowed, no path that needs to be followed. And yet the mind may continue to point itself somewhere. It looks for signs of progress, for deeper calm, for clearer quiet, for a sense that it is heading in the right direction. This orientation creates subtle restlessness. As long as the self is going somewhere, it cannot fully stop. The Stoics understood that direction belongs to purpose. Night does not operate on purpose. There is nothing here to move toward, nothing to align with, nothing to become. When this is recognized, the forward pull begins to dissolve. Thoughts no longer arrange themselves toward an outcome. They lose their sense of trajectory. They appear, then drift, without leading anywhere. Awareness becomes less pointed, less intentional, more diffuse. The body responds naturally. Muscles soften when they are no longer oriented toward movement. Breathing deepens when it is no longer preparing for the next step. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind releases its need to arrive. Arrival is meaningful only where action follows. Here nothing follows. There is no better place for the self to be, no more correct state to enter. The night does not reward direction. It offers rest through stillness. When the self no longer points itself forward, it settles into where it already is. This settling is not stagnation. It is completion without conclusion. The self does not disappear without direction. It becomes lighter. Attention loosens its orientation. Experience becomes less linear, less goal-shaped. The night holds this openness gently. Nothing needs to guide the self now. Nothing needs to pull it onward. And in the absence of direction, the self finally stops moving, not because it has reached the right place, but because it has recognized that there was nowhere it needed to go. When direction fades, the mind may still wait for one last thing. Resolution, a sense that something inside must settle completely, that questions should close, that tensions should dissolve into clarity before rest is allowed. The Stoics noticed this impulse with precision. They understood that the mind often treats resolution as safety, as proof that nothing remains unfinished or uncertain. During the day, resolution has value. Decisions are concluded. Conflicts are addressed. Loose ends are tied to allow movement forward. But night does not belong to forward movement. There is no situation here that improves through final answers. No inner conflict that must be solved before sleep can begin. No clarity that needs to be achieved for rest to be deserved. And yet, the mind often continues searching. It revisits questions without expecting answers. It waits for a sense of completion that never quite arrives. This waiting keeps the self lightly awake. The Stoics understood that many things in life remain unresolved, not because they are neglected, but because resolution is not always possible or necessary. Night is not a space for conclusion, it is a space for suspension. When this is allowed, the pressure to finish begins to ease. Thoughts no longer need to reach agreement. Emotions no longer need to settle into certainty. Contradictions are allowed to remain. Awareness becomes more permissive, less demanding of closure. The body responds immediately. Muscles soften when they are no longer bracing for an ending. Breathing deepens when it is no longer waiting for a signal that everything is complete. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops insisting on finality. Resolution belongs to action and reflection. Night belongs to rest. Nothing essential is threatened by remaining open until morning. Nothing important depends on finishing now. The self does not fragment without resolution. It relaxes. In this relaxation, experience becomes quieter, less insistent, less urgent. The night does not require answers. It does not demand certainty. It allows questions to remain unanswered without consequence. And when the need for resolution dissolves, the self releases another layer of effort, no longer waiting for completion, no longer holding itself in suspense. Rest deepens here in the open space where nothing must be settled, nothing must be concluded, and nothing needs to be brought to an end before the mind is free to let go. When the need for resolution softens, the mind may still hold on to a quieter demand. Certainty, a sense that something must be known clearly, that ambiguity should be reduced, that inner ground should feel stable and defined before rest is allowed. The Stoics paid close attention to this impulse. They understood that certainty provides comfort during action, but becomes a burden when nothing needs to be decided. During the day, certainty supports movement. It guides choice. It reduces hesitation. It allows the mind to commit to a direction. But night does not require commitment. There is no decision waiting here, no path that depends on confidence, no risk that must be calculated away. And yet the mind may continue to seek solid ground. It checks whether feelings make sense. It asks whether thoughts are justified. It looks for reassurance that everything is understood well enough. This search creates quiet tension. As long as certainty is required, the mind remains alert, scanning for clarity that does not belong to this moment. The Stoics understood that uncertainty is not a flaw in rest. It is a natural condition when action pauses. At night, not knowing is harmless. Nothing essential depends on clarity now. When this is allowed, the pressure to understand begins to ease. Thoughts no longer need to arrive at conclusions. Questions no longer need answers. Doubts no longer need to be resolved. Awareness becomes more spacious, less anchored to explanation, less invested in firm ground. The body responds naturally. Muscles release when there is no longer a need to brace against uncertainty. Breathing deepens when it is no longer tied to reassurance. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind accepts uncertainty without resistance. Certainty belongs to moments of choice. Night belongs to openness. There is no danger in not knowing who you are right now. No harm in not understanding what something means. No loss in letting questions remain unanswered. The self does not weaken in uncertainty. It rests. In this resting, experience becomes softer, less defined, less demanding. The night does not offer answers. It offers permission. Permission to not know. Permission to not decide. Permission to not be sure. And when the self no longer seeks certainty, it releases another layer of effort, allowing rest to deepen in a space where nothing needs to be clear, nothing needs to be settled, and nothing needs to be known before the mind can finally let go. When certainty is released, another quiet habit may still remain: the need for approval, a subtle sense that the self should be acceptable to others, to memory, or even to itself. The Stoics observed this tendency with care. They understood how easily the mind seeks validation, even when no audience is present. During the day, approval plays a role. Actions are measured by response. Choices are shaped by expectation. Social life depends, in part, on being seen in a certain way. But night removes the audience. There is no one here to approve or disapprove, no standard being applied, no judgment forming in response to who you are. And yet the mind may continue its quiet checking. It reviews how it appeared. It wonders whether it was enough. It listens for an echo of acceptance. This checking keeps the self lightly engaged, holding it in a posture of evaluation. The Stoics understood that approval is meaningful only in relation to action. It guides behavior. It influences conduct. But night does not require conduct. Nothing here needs to be liked. Nothing needs to be justified as acceptable. Nothing needs permission to exist. When this is recognized, the need for approval begins to soften. Thoughts no longer ask whether they are appropriate. Feelings no longer need to be endorsed. Experience is allowed without review. Awareness becomes less comparative, less invested in how things appear. The body responds naturally. Muscles release when there is no longer a need to present. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by self-consciousness. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops seeking affirmation in moments where none is required. Approval belongs to relationship and action. Night belongs to neutrality. There is no inner judge active here, no standard to meet, no measure to satisfy. The self does not become unsafe without approval. It becomes quiet. In this quiet, experience loosens its edges. It no longer positions itself for acceptance. The night does not evaluate you. It does not respond to who you are. It allows the self to exist without feedback. And when the need for approval dissolves, another layer of effort falls away, freeing the self from the habit of looking outward or inward for confirmation. Rest deepens here, in the absence of judgment, where nothing needs to be accepted, nothing needs to be affirmed, and nothing needs to be approved before the mind can finally be at ease. When the need for approval fades, another closely related impulse may still remain: the need to justify. A quiet effort to explain why the self is the way it is, why certain thoughts appeared, why certain feelings lingered, why the day unfolded as it did. The Stoics noticed this habit clearly. They understood that justification is a form of defense, an attempt to make the self reasonable, acceptable, or coherent in hindsight. During the day, justification can serve a purpose. It clarifies intention. It repairs misunderstanding. It helps the mind place events into a logical order. But night removes the need for explanation. There is no one here asking why. No situation that needs to be defended. No version of yourself that must be made sensible. And yet the mind often continues its quiet arguments. It prepares explanations that will never be spoken. It revisits choices as if a verdict were pending. This effort keeps the self slightly engaged, holding it in a posture of readiness. The Stoics understood that justification belongs to interaction. It is shaped by dialogue, response, and consequence. Night contains none of these. Nothing here is on trial. Nothing needs to be explained in order to be allowed. When this is recognized, the pressure to justify begins to ease. Thoughts no longer need to prove their relevance. Feelings no longer need reasons to be permitted. Experience does not need to defend itself. Awareness becomes less argumentative, less invested in cause and effect. The body responds naturally. Muscles soften when there is no longer a need to hold a position. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by inner debate. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops explaining itself unnecessarily. Justification is a tool of discourse. Night is not a discussion. There is no requirement to make sense of yourself here, no obligation to render your inner life reasonable. The self does not improve through justification at this hour. It only becomes tired. When justification is set aside, another layer of effort falls away. The mind no longer rehearses defenses. It no longer anticipates judgment. The night does not demand clarity of motive. It does not request explanation. It allows the self to exist without argument. And in this allowance, the self finally relaxes its need to account for itself, resting in a space where nothing must be explained, nothing must be defended, and nothing must be justified before the mind can fully let go. When justification is released, the mind may still wait for something quieter and more subtle. Recognition, a sense that the self should be noticed by others, by memory, or by itself. The Stoics were attentive to this impulse. They understood how easily recognition becomes a silent requirement, even when no one is present to give it. During the day, recognition plays a role. Effort is acknowledged. Presence is affirmed. Identity is reinforced through being seen. Recognition helps orient the self within social life. It confirms existence through response. But night removes this structure. There is no one here to notice you, no awareness that needs to be reflected back, no mirror waiting to confirm that you are present. And yet the mind may still hover nearby, checking whether it is being felt, whether its state is registered, whether rest is happening in a way that can be noticed. This quiet monitoring keeps the self lightly engaged. The Stoics understood that recognition is meaningful only in relation. It depends on an exchange. Night offers no exchange. Nothing here needs to be seen to exist. Nothing becomes more real by being noticed. When this is recognized, the need for recognition begins to soften. Thoughts no longer ask to be acknowledged. Feelings no longer seek confirmation. Experience is allowed without reflection. Awareness becomes less self-referential, less concerned with being present as someone. The body responds naturally. Muscles release when there is no need to be perceived. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by self-awareness. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind no longer seeks proof of its own presence. Existence does not require acknowledgement. Rest does not require recognition. You do not need to feel yourself resting in order to rest. You do not need to notice silence for silence to be real. In this lightness, experience loses its edge. It no longer turns back on itself. The night does not reflect you. It does not respond. It simply holds. And in this holding, the self finally steps out of view, not erased, not denied, but no longer requiring confirmation. Rest deepens here in the absence of recognition, where nothing needs to be seen, nothing needs to be felt as mine, and nothing needs to be noticed for the mind to finally be at ease. When recognition falls away, the mind may still hold on to another quiet assumption, that the self must remain continuous, a sense that experience should connect smoothly from moment to moment, that awareness should not break, that there should be an unbroken thread linking who you were earlier to who you are now. The Stoics noticed this assumption with care. They understood how strongly the mind values continuity, and how easily it mistakes continuity for safety. During the day, continuity supports function. Memory links actions together. Identity remains coherent across time. Responsibility depends on a stable sense of self. But night loosens this structure. There is no task here that requires an unbroken thread. No role that depends on persistence. No responsibility that must carry across moments. And yet, the mind often tries to stay present to itself, as if a lapse in continuity would mean losing something essential. The Stoics saw that this fear is misplaced. Continuity is not a requirement of existence. It is a convenience of action. At night, experience does not need to line up. Moments do not need to follow one another cleanly. Awareness can thin, fade, and return without consequence. Nothing important is lost when the thread loosens. Thoughts may appear in fragments, sensations may come and go without sequence. Time may feel uneven or incomplete. This is not disorientation, it is rest. When the mind allows breaks in continuity, pressure eases. There is no need to remember where you were a moment ago, no need to keep track of awareness, no need to ensure that experience remains connected. Awareness becomes intermittent, soft. Unconcerned with maintaining itself, the body responds immediately. Muscles release when they are no longer holding experience together. Breathing deepens when it is no longer tied to alert presence. The Stoics believe that peace appears when the mind stops insisting on constant presence. Presence belongs to action. Night allows absence. There is no danger in drifting, no harm in gaps, no failure in losing the thread for a while. The self does not vanish when continuity breaks. It rests. And when it returns, it does so naturally, without having been damaged by absence. The night does not require a continuous self. It does not ask for sustained awareness. It allows experience to loosen, to fragment gently, to fade in and out without meaning. And in this permission, the self finally releases its effort to remain intact across time, settling into a quieter rhythm where nothing needs to be connected, nothing needs to be remembered from one moment to the next, and nothing needs to stay awake to ensure that the self continues. When continuity is allowed to loosen, the mind may still hold on to another quiet demand: stability, a belief that the self should remain steady, that inner ground should not shift too much, that emotions, thoughts, and awareness should settle into a stable configuration before rest can truly begin. The Stoics noticed how deeply this desire for stability shapes inner tension. They understood that stability is valuable where action depends on it, but unnecessary where nothing needs to be sustained. During the day, stability supports function. It allows consistency in behavior. It creates reliability across situations. It gives the sense that one stands on firm ground, but night does not require firm ground. There is no position to maintain here, no balance that must be preserved, no inner structure that needs reinforcement. And yet, the mind may continue checking for steadiness. It notices fluctuations in mood. It becomes uneasy when awareness feels uneven or diffuse. It looks for signs that things are settling properly. This monitoring creates subtle strain. The Stoics understood that instability at night is not disorder. It is the natural movement of a mind no longer anchored by purpose. Thoughts may drift unpredictably. Feelings may shift without reason. Awareness may expand and contract without warning. Nothing important is threatened by this movement. The self does not collapse when it is unstable. It simply stops bracing. When the demand for stability softens, the inner effort to hold steady releases. Thoughts no longer need to settle into a calm pattern. Emotions no longer need to smooth themselves out. Awareness no longer needs to feel even or centered. The body responds immediately. Muscles soften when they are no longer holding balance. Breathing deepens when it is no longer regulating internal state. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops resisting its own natural fluctuations. Stability belongs to action and responsibility. Night belongs to movement without consequence. There is no danger in inner shifting here, no harm in not feeling grounded, no failure in being unsteady. The night does not require equilibrium. It does not ask for composure. It allows the self to sway, to loosen, to move without needing to settle anywhere. And in this permission, the self releases another layer of effort, no longer holding itself upright, no longer seeking firm footing. Rest deepens here not because the self has become stable, but because it has been freed from the quiet obligation to remain steady. When stability is no longer demanded, the mind may still search for one final anchor, meaning, a quiet belief that the self should signify something, that experiences should point somewhere, that thoughts and feelings should add up to an understanding of who you are, or what this moment represents. The Stoics observed this habit carefully. They understood that meaning often brings order during the day, but becomes weight when it is carried into rest. During waking life, meaning organizes effort. It links events together. It helps the mind endure difficulty by placing it within a larger story. But night does not belong to narrative. There is nothing here that needs interpretation, no message to decode, no lesson to extract before rest is allowed. And yet the mind may continue quietly assigning significance. It wonders what the day meant, what certain emotions reveal, what this moment says about you. This search keeps the self engaged. The Stoics understood that meaning is not always required for experience to be complete. Some moments exist fully without explanation. Some states are finished simply by passing. At night, meaning adds pressure where none is needed. When the mind allows meaning to loosen, experience becomes simpler. Thoughts no longer ask what they represent. Feelings no longer need to stand for anything. Sensations are allowed without translation. Awareness becomes less symbolic, less interpretive, less invested in understanding. The body responds naturally. Muscles soften when there is no longer a story to hold. Breathing deepens when it is no longer shaped by reflection. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops turning every experience into a sign. Meaning belongs to reflection and memory. Night belongs to immediacy. There is no requirement that this moment makes sense. No need for it to contribute to identity or insight. The self does not lose value when meaning is absent. It rests. In this resting, experience becomes quieter, more direct, less layered. The night does not explain itself. It does not justify its existence. It simply unfolds. And when the self no longer searches for meaning, another layer of effort dissolves, freeing attention from interpretation, freeing awareness from narrative. Rest deepens here, in the simple presence of what is, where nothing needs to stand for anything else, nothing needs to be understood, and nothing needs to mean something for the mind to finally let go. When meaning is released, the mind may still hold on to one final orientation, purpose, a quiet sense that the self should be for something, that experience should be moving toward use, that even rest should serve a function beyond itself. The Stoics noticed how deeply purpose shapes the inner world. They understood that purpose organizes action, but becomes a burden when carried into moments where action has paused. During the day, purpose gives direction. It aligns effort. It connects intention to outcome. But night removes the need for alignment. There is nothing here that must be aimed toward, no objective waiting to be fulfilled, no future state that depends on what happens now. And yet the mind may continue to frame experience as preparation. It wonders whether rest is sufficient, whether this pause is useful, whether something is being gained. This orientation keeps the self lightly engaged, never fully allowing it to stop. The Stoics understood that purpose belongs to movement. It has no function where nothing is meant to be done. At night, the self does not need to serve anything. It does not need to contribute, advance, or improve. Nothing essential is endangered by purposelessness here. When this is recognized, the pressure to be useful begins to dissolve. Thoughts no longer need to lead somewhere. Feelings no longer need to justify themselves through relevance. Experience is allowed to exist without direction. Awareness becomes less goal-shaped, less invested in outcome, less concerned with future benefit. The body responds naturally. Muscles soften when they are no longer oriented toward function. Breathing deepens when it is no longer tied to readiness. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind releases its need to be productive at all times. Purpose belongs to daylight. Night belongs to permission. There is no failure in resting without aim, no loss in allowing experience to be without use. The self does not disappear when purpose fades, it becomes quieter. In this quiet, experience loosens its grip on direction. It no longer pushes forward or holds back. The night does not ask what this moment is for. It does not measure value by usefulness. It allows the self to exist without assignment, and when the need for purpose dissolves, the final layer of striving releases, freeing the self from orientation, from usefulness, from direction. Rest deepens here in the absence of purpose, where nothing needs to lead anywhere, nothing needs to serve a future moment, and nothing needs to be for something in order for the mind to finally be still. Across this series, nothing about the self was corrected. Nothing was refined, nothing was made clearer. What changed was the assumption that the self must remain active. Layer by layer, the quiet duties fell away. The need to hold identity together, to explain, justify, improve, protect, or direct it. The Stoics understood that the self is not something that needs constant attention. It is something that appears when needed and rests when it is not. Night reveals this simply. There is no role to maintain here, no coherence to protect, no meaning or purpose to uphold. The self does not disappear when it is unattended. It relaxes. And in this relaxation, effort dissolves without instruction. Nothing essential is lost when identity softens. Nothing important is harmed when the self steps out of the way. The night does not require a version of you. It does not ask for continuity, stability, or direction. It allows experience to exist without a center. And when the self no longer insists on being present, rest deepens naturally, not as an achievement, but as what remains when nothing is left that needs to be maintained.